Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the contest we launched to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, the deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current classic books. I'm Steph Rouse. In this episode, I'm joined by co-host Amy Hazy of RDG Planning and Design and author Dan Parolek to talk about his latest book, Missing Middle Housing, and the ability of this range of housing type to help solve the housing crisis we're facing across the nation. Let's dive in. Dan, thank you for joining us today to talk about your book, Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. To start off, can you give our audience a little background on yourself and explain what prompted you to write this book?
Yes, Stephanie, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm Dan Parolek. I'm the founding principal of Opticos Design. It's a urban design and architecture practice with our main office being in Berkeley, California, and a new satellite office now in Chicago. And I started Opticos in 2000, so quite some time ago, after getting a master's of urban design degree from UC Berkeley, and saw a real need for the services that I was interested in providing. And so I have an undergraduate degree and Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Notre Dame. Practiced architecture for a number of years in New York City, and then moved to Berkeley to get a master's degree in urban design because I wanted to shift. I knew even through the first few years of my architecture practice that I really wanted to be working at a neighborhood, city, and sort of regional scale. And that's why I decided to make that shift. And I just bring a really strong passion for the built environment, in particular for walkable communities. And I do feel that even just the point of growing up in a quintessential small mid-American town of Columbus, Nebraska, really had a strong influence on my perception and interest in walkable urbanism. Because at the time, when I was growing up, I could ride my bike across town, a very vibrant downtown with a couple of hardware stores, restaurants, JCPenney, Sears were all still in downtown. And I mentioned earlier that my great-grandmother lived in downtown in a missing middle duplex. So sort of experienced this very, very early on. Why did I decide to write this book? It was interesting. So my form-based code book was released in 2008, and there were just a series of a sort of projects, some research that we were doing. I was doing a lot of form-based code training through the Form-Based Code Institute. And we started a couple of citywide zoning code update projects, one in Flagstaff, Arizona, and one in Cincinnati, where we were just started realizing that, yes, zoning is a really big barrier for the delivery of walkable urbanism, but even more so, we were realizing that it was a tremendous barrier for the delivery of these missing middle housing choices. So in 2011, I wrote the first article on missing middle housing for the Smart Growth Network, and we created the diagram for that article. And almost immediately people got extremely interested in this idea of missing middle housing. We were getting fairly frequent requests for more information. And that really led to, in 2016, we launched missingmiddlehousing.com as just a free online resource because there were so many requests that we couldn't respond to and didn't have the time to write, take the time to write the book at that time. And then finally, I got the time to carve out and write the Missing Middle book. And just, it was great after, sort of was traveling across the country from 2011 to 2020 fairly consistently, several times a month, giving presentations on missing middle housing at. Sometimes it's a planning conference. Sometimes it was community groups. Sometimes a mayor would invite me in. It was a real estate, ULI. So it was a pretty broad range of audiences that were just growing more and more interested in this. So it was just great to get the chance to finally sit down, carve out the time, and really record my thoughts in the book. And the response, it was released in 2020, sort of late spring, early summer, and the response has been really strong. It's on its second printing. It shifted over the last 5 years from a nice to know for planners and architects and even city decision makers and developers to a need to know topic, because it's really one of the tools and ideas that every city needs in their housing toolkit to respond to the growing need for more choices, but also more attainability, like more attainable, affordable housing choices.
As a fellow Northeast Nebraska native, I enjoyed your description of Columbus and the housing variety that you saw around you. Do you think missing middle housing plays a role in building community? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we actually, in that very first article I wrote about missing middle housing, one of the characteristics that I defined based on our research, observation, form-based code work, other planning and architecture work, was that people were really longing for a sense of community. And these types were reinforcing the sense of community in a couple of different ways. First of all, the neighborhoods that we were studying, planning for, touring, just had a really strong sense of community. It was really clear people knew each other. This isn't scientific, but I feel like there's a block party index, like the types of neighborhoods that actually close the street off 2 or 3 times a year and have a block party probably have a mix of missing middle types, bungalows, single family, a really broad mix is what our general observation was. And then in terms of there's courtyard housing types and bungalow courts that inherently, even like small fourplexes, whenever we're out on a walking tour, a missing middle walking tour, we'll be in a group of 30 or 40 people. This might be at an APA conference or a CNU conference, or now AARP's hosting these walking tours. And 30 people out in front of your building looking and talking and pointing at your building, people will come out and ask, well, what are you guys up to? And once they get beyond sort of we're not trying to do some bad things, they get really excited to talk to us about this community and this building that they're living in. And so I feel like it's inherent in these types, and both the neighborhood scale and the building scale, and that strong sense of community that it has delivered and can deliver for sure. And our development projects, the sort of architecture and master planning scale projects we do with developers, I think that's one of the biggest differentiators for our developers, is that their projects are delivering a sense of place and a quality of living and a community that is actually really hard to find in new projects, new developments these days, whether it's apartments, multifamily project that, these tend to be sort of isolated and kind of the same building stamped over and over on a site, or even just single family subdivisions that are pretty sterile and soulless in a lot of instances. So I think they absolutely, that's a core component and characteristic of missing middle types and missing middle neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think over the years, I've heard great stories of different projects that really bring people together. And I think some of the best ones I've heard are ones where it's retirees, not planned retirement project, but ends up attracting a lot of retirees. And they end up having this sense of community and belonging that is so important for the health of our seniors, that you just naturally occurs in an environment like that. So I
Yes.
absolutely agree with you. And you can see it in action, like you said. You talk about form and scale being more important than density. Can you talk a little more about what that means to you and what you think that begins to look like on the ground?
One of my really strong messages, even through my form-based coding work, we wrote our first form-based code in 2000. And I would say that when we submitted the administrative draft, the county planners, like they'd had no idea what they were looking at. It was a form-based code. And at the time that was super progressive. And the great thing now is it's basically a best practice standard, I guess, as most cities are asking for at least some component of it. And part of that early sort of messaging and communication is that just the shift away from an operating system that's based on these random metrics of density and FAR and lot coverage, and shift it to a conversation in a system that functions on a form and scale operating system, because that's really ultimately what's most important to most people. And that's what creates a more predictable built environment. And I think the disconnect is we have a planning and a zoning system that's primarily based on density, and it assumes that high density equals a big building, right? If you have a comprehensive plan, or if you have a zoning code that allows 70 units per acre, it's assuming this is like a 5, 7, 8, 10-story building, right? But there are a lot of really excellent missing middle examples that are 2 stories. Like just an example I often use, it's in Midtown Sacramento, California. It's a 2-story courtyard building, C-shaped building on a 100-foot by 100-foot lot. And we discovered this on a walking tour, an example that a lot of people can relate to, but it actually generates a density of almost 100 dwelling units per acre at 2 stories. And it kind of blows people's minds, because that's not the way like we think about density, or that density that our system works. And so what we tell cities is a quick fix, without going to more of a form-based approach, would be just to create future land use districts or zoning districts that just say high density but small scale, house scale. Like that would be the quick fix. But that's why we talk about the shift away from that as a sort of a planning system. And then I think just as importantly, and I think this is one of the reasons the concept of missing middle housing has really caught on so broadly now across the world. Now they're having robust conversations in Canada, parts of Australia are having really great missing middle discussions. And it's because it's shifted the conversation away from that scary D word, density, right? Nobody wants density in their neighborhood. Every article you read about housing it's like, we're increasing the density. In terms of framing, it's a really bad way to frame a conversation about housing, because you'll get a knee-jerk negative response from 99% of people if you use the term density. And so just it's important to shift that conversation away from those metrics that really don't predictably deliver good results, and more to that form and scale. And, one of the diagrams we created specifically for the book was a diagram that demonstrates how to regulate this house scale, which is really important to missing middle, which is by regulating the height, the width, and the depth, maximum height, maximum width, and maximum depth of the building. I'd say very few zoning codes do that, but it's a really critical part to getting to the missing middle scale, not just focusing on height. And I think this is actually part of the reason I'm pretty adamant that I feel that every planner that's going through schooling, getting their ed planning degree, should have a foundation in physical planning, not just policy. And UC Berkeley has been pretty good about this primarily because of Ellen Jacobs, the author of the Great Streets books, sort of really pushed for it, have been a big proponent for it. And I recently sat on a committee for the National APA that talked about the relationship between policy and design, and what skill sets planners should have. And I think it's really inherent based on the complexity of urban environments and the fact that more and more people want to live in walkable urbanism, that planners have that solid foundation in form and scale and physical planning. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And I think your point about density is so important of people just, I think, in a certain way, not even kind of understanding really what it means. And I remember being in a conversation with a group who was kind of fighting some neighborhood. They viewed it as trying to densify their neighborhood. And, I posed the question of, if the unit looks like it fits in your neighborhood, if the structure looks like it fits in your neighborhood, and we're addressing parking concerns, what's our concern? What are we afraid of? It created some interesting quietness, but also some interesting dialogue. But yeah, you're exactly right. Because I think most people have a hard time visualizing what density means, and they kind of just end up fearing it then. And I mentioned parking there, which kind of actually leads nicely into my next question. Even if cities sometimes are removing some of the parking requirements, developers often believe that they still have to provide that parking. Do you see this mentality changing? If not, then how do we convince the developers, especially in places where transit is challenging because of the lower density adjacent areas that are maybe around it? How do we start to kind of change that narrative a little bit more, I guess?
I think it's shifting with the development community. I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about the bungalows on the lake, or what we call the Prairie Queen neighborhood in Papillion, is that it's a suburban location. There is no transit, but it is parked at one parking space off street per unit. And the rest of the parking is provided on street. And, some developers in the past that we've been talking to say, like, well, the market's not going to respond to that. It's going to compromise our rents. We live in a cold weather climate. Everybody wants a garage. And we've heard a lot of pushback, but now we have an example of exactly how this can perform. And that project, from what I understand from our client, Jerry Reimer, is actually outperforming every other multifamily project in the entire Omaha metro. And so it's a great case study in a lot of ways. And parking is one of the ways. And people love the fact that they can park in front of their unit, their home, and walk up to their front porch and not have to walk across a big parking lot. And they can see their car, right? They can see their car out their living room window or their bedroom window, and it functions more like a neighborhood, right? Obviously, the on-street parking is critical. So you wouldn't be able to do that in an area that didn't have on-street parking. But that demonstrates, because it's always like, oh, people in our region aren't going to live without a car. We don't have the kind of transit that a place like the Bay Area has. I'm like, well, here's a great example of, like, here's how we can make it work. It helps the project pencil out from the developer standpoint, because they're not using a lot of land for a big inefficient parking lot. And hey, by the way, the street is the parking lot and the city is actually the one maintaining it. So it helps that pro forma, helps the missing middle project actually pencil out and make sense for the developer. And so I think that's a great example. And I think that actually just yesterday it was released, we created a missing middle guidebook for AARP. And we actually did, I can't remember if it's two or 4 pages on parking, because we know that's the biggest area of pushback from a lot of community members. And we did sort of dove down deep into some of the misperceptions and some of the important messaging points on parking. So I just encourage anyone that's listening to this, just Google AARP and missing middle housing, and you'll see that download come up. It's a great resource.
This isn't your first partnership with AARP, correct? You've done some other things, because they've recently did a code audit here in Omaha, and I believe you kind of helped them get on that path. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we've had a partnership with AARP for, it's been close to 6 or 7 years. We were super excited when they reached out to us, and they had, as an organization and part of their Livable Communities initiative, prioritized walkable communities and housing choice, and are right now some of the biggest proponents of missing middle housing. And as part of their technical assistance program, it started out mostly with just presentations. And I think one of the times I was in Omaha presenting, it was co-hosted by the state chapter of AARP. And we started doing walking tours, started doing informational booklets, and then it sort of transitioned to some more, they realized, like, hey, this is really valuable information, and maybe we can get a little bit more technical with our audience and help spread the message, the important message about this. And so, yeah, we're sort of really diving deeply into content that might have historically been more of what we would present to planners at the APA conference, or when we're working with the city or a county. And so it's great to have that relationship. And we actually have had recent conversations about, well, what's the next step? So, where can we take this? And I think they're thinking really big about helping promote missing middle, even to the point of thinking about a potential product line of sort of age-friendly missing middle prototypes, which would be super exciting to work on.
Yeah. And I think what's really exciting about that is just the overall accessibility. So even if down the road, I always say, when my generation, which isn't as big as the baby boomers, will have more accessible units for everybody in the whole population when you start talking about projects like that. So that's really exciting to hear. You note that middle can also mean middle income, but that you can also meet the demand for those upper ranges. And I realize middle income depends on what part of the country you're kind of in. What do you think are some of the best examples or strategies for hitting that middle income range with this product type?
It's important, and a lot of the times we find that the missing middle message is focusing primarily on sort of attainability for middle income households, and it ignores form and scale aspect. And we sort of say it's important to sort of make sure it's both, right? I think the most important message we've been sending is like, these are house scale buildings that have multiple units in it. So it's important to discuss both. But I think in terms of our Muse homes project, it's in a community called Daybreak in the Salt Lake City region. And the builder came to us, and their business model was based on the delivery of large suburban single family homes, but they were smart enough to realize, hey, the market's shifting. There's more and more of the market that wants something else. And then secondarily, because the entry-level buyer was one of their target markets historically, they couldn't deliver single-family homes at a price point that entry-level buyers could afford. And then they started building some tuck-under townhouses, ground floor parking and 2 stories of housing of townhouse above. But they couldn't even deliver those at a price point that the entry-level household buyer could afford. And so they're like, well, how can missing middle housing help us address this and deliver attainability to that entry-level buyer? And so we designed the Muse homes, and they were able to sell those at a price point about $30,000 less per unit than a conventional townhouse. And there were a number of different reasons for that. And at the time, which was about 5 years ago, the prices have gone up, obviously, but it started at $189,000 for a 2-bedroom unit, 900 square feet, up to 220 for the 1,400 square foot. And at the time, it was the only homes that were being delivered below $200,000 in this entire large master plan community. So there's some great ways. I think part of it's just getting really creative with, hey, can we design a unit that's 10 to 20% smaller, but really well designed so that it lives maybe even better than that house that's, start to think about attaching the units, trying to keep it 2 stories, really simple form and scale so it's easy to build. So there's a lot of really creative ways that missing middle can help achieve that. Affordability by design is sometimes what we call it. This isn't capital A affordable, it has some sort of subsidy. It's just, can a developer build this and sell it or rent it at a price point that, a middle income family can afford? And yeah, every market that's a little bit different, right? But we've done this work with developers now all across the country in a lot of different markets, and it has proven successful to deliver, just as long as the developer's smart about the delivery of the missing middle types.
And I've been kind of curious lately too, the impact that technology can start to have in this realm too. I mean, modular construction is not new, but there's some innovative things being done with that in multi-unit buildings using modular construction, as you're very familiar in California, because it's nothing new out in your area. There's just lots of things happening, I guess, around technologies. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and the impact that could even be having on trying to meet that middle price point, middle income.
Yes, I think modular is the future of missing middle. The missing middle is missing from the modular conversation, and we're trying to fix that as well. Right, in California, modular's caught on, but it's all for 5, 7+ story buildings. Right, there's super efficient project for a developer to just stack a bunch of boxes, which is great. We need it. We need more of that too. And then there's a lot of small lot, single family, cottage scale. And then there's some townhouse scale, right? And we've actually worked with a really great developer client, modular manufacturer out of Buena Vista, Colorado, called Fading West. And they've built a couple of workforce housing projects that are small lot, single family, and townhouses built modular in their factory. We're looking at future collaborations with groups like that to really make the full range of missing middle types more broadly available. I think it is the future. You don't have the efficiencies of the bigger buildings, right? Or the perceived efficiencies. And then you don't have the simplicity of a single family detached cottage. So there's reasons that it hasn't been done, but it needs to be figured out. And I think that's really important. I actually feel like there's some great opportunities in smaller towns and even in small towns sprinkled across Nebraska to test and really utilize, missing middle generally, but modular, because the lack of the trades and the builders to deliver it. So it makes total sense to be able to, ship a couple pieces of a building or 4 or 5 pieces of a fourplex and put them together and have a building constructed much more quickly. It's super interesting. And I think it's a necessary part of getting to where we need to be with missing middle.
A few years ago, when APA National was in San Francisco, I got to tour one of the Bay Area modular facilities. And yeah, it's exciting to see what they're doing. And I think you're exactly right when we start talking about how we're producing housing in the Midwest, where we have labor shortages and trades shortages. The appeal of you get to be in a nice climate controlled environment all day and construct something that has some pretty good quality control on it, is an interesting solution, I think, to some of the things we're seeing here.
Yeah, and I think it's even some of those bigger companies are struggling to digitize their systems is what we're seeing. They're building indoors, but there's no digitization or automation that's really necessary to get the efficiencies out of the system. So that's super interesting. And I have a lot of colleagues in Michigan, and the states had a lot of programs that are trying to incentivize the delivery of modular to mixed success. They've had some successes, but it hasn't spread as much as they might have liked.
In the past, I don't feel like the wealth building opportunities have been discussed as much. So first, can you talk a little bit about what this means and the opportunity here? And maybe to just, with inflation and rising costs, do you see those discussions happening more, the wealth building opportunities?
Yeah, I think just more broadly, there's always a question or conversation point about for sale versus rental. And I feel like in every market, there's a need for both. And there's more and more rental housing that's needed. There's a more sophisticated renter that's looking they don't want to live in a conventional garden apartment project. And the for sale side, yeah, I think fewer and fewer households can afford to buy a single family detached house. So we're at a spot with cost of construction, cost of land that we need to be looking at. Well, if they can't afford to buy a single family home, what could they afford to purchase to build some equity? Them as their life transitions, they get married or have kids or whatever that transition might be, then they can move into a bigger house and use that equity. And I think that I just was actually reading an article in the LA Times that was called "With Interest Rates Surging, What Does a Starter Home Look Like in Southern California?" And they interviewed a handful of younger people that were searching for a home. And they had this ideal of, yes, we'd love to live in a single family home. But the reality is, they had just gotten to the point where they couldn't afford it. And so both of the people that they interviewed ended up living in missing middle. One was a little courtyard housing type that they bought a neat little historic 1-bedroom. And then the other one was a woman and her husband who bought a unit in a duplex. And she's like, not exactly what we not the single family ideal we had in mind, but like, this is what we could afford. And I think that's the new reality, is this idea that everybody can afford to buy a single family detached house. I think we just need to rethink that, and are needing to rethink that in our policy, our planning, our zoning needs to enable that more readily so that the development community can step up and start to deliver it like our clients are doing in projects across the country. There's another piece of this that I was thinking about when I was reading through these questions. I think there's also an equity, a really important equity conversation. And, I was pretty shocked to find out, I don't know, it was like probably three or 4 years ago when I was reading, I think it was The Color of Law. And I sort of heard the statistic that a Black household has 10% of the average wealth of a white household. So what can we do to, we've had historically sort of federal policy planning and zoning that was really discriminatory and made it impossible, if not really hard, to enable those Black and brown households to actually purchase a home and build that household wealth. And so part of this is, well, what role could missing middle play? Well, it's not the silver bullet, but I think it's part of a thoughtful solution to enable more households to be able to purchase, to build that equity and build that household wealth over time, that multi-generational wealth, and to start to think about sort of filling that gap a little bit.
And I think too, just the opportunity to have mixed income that happens kind of naturally. You mentioned the Prairie Queen, and the developer on that often says that it just naturally happened that they have mixed income out there because he has units that are $900 a month and he has units that are $3,000 a month. And so you just naturally have a mixed income project. And I think that is an important part of this kind of opportunity that we have here too.
Yeah, I think that, back to that conversation about sense of community, I think that really helps as well. Is like the neighborhoods are a little bit more organic and definitely more diverse. And yeah, there's one particular woman who's just thrilled to be living in the neighborhood because she can go out, she's living in that small 1-bedroom apartment and she's out walking her dog and runs into the doctor who's leasing the $3,000 a month townhouse. And she's lived in more conventional garden apartment projects for a really long time. And it didn't have that sort of economic diversity in those types of projects. So she's really thrilled. I think that sort of informally also allows, like maybe there's a kid who's living in one of those more affordable units and they can rub elbows with that doctor. And when they get older and need an internship or need to interview, somebody that they're aspiring to be, they have access to those sorts of people, which I think is a super healthy and just really excellent aspect of these types of communities and types.
That kind of leads, I guess, into another question that I've been thinking about. And now that you've seen, and maybe you've actually kind of already answered it, but now that you've maybe seen several of the missing middle projects developed, what demographic do you see being attracted to these units? And have there been any surprises, I guess, in the demographics that have been attracted to the projects you've been involved with?
I would say the household type that's shown up the strongest in both for sale and for rent missing middle projects that we've designed and our clients have built are single women households. It's pretty shocking to people to realize that 1/3 of all households are a single person, right? And we're definitely not building housing specifically for those household types. And especially with like cottage courts and courtyard housing, single women households seem to really like the sense of security that comes along and sense of community that comes along with those types. And then I would say secondarily, it's the downsizing baby boomer. And, this is why AARP is so interested in this. And, we knew, for example, in Prairie Queen that they were going to show up, but they have shown up in much bigger numbers. The stories that Jerry's hearing is a couple that lived in Western Omaha out in some big house, might have been a 5,000 square foot house. And they're downsizing, they're not going to downsize to an 800 square foot unit. They'll downsize to like a 1,000 or 1,200 square foot unit. And they want the single level ground floor unit. And so we have to be really thoughtful about that in the design of our projects. And 1/3 of that generation wants to live in a walkable environment, and that's growing. And 2/3 of millennials want to live in a walkable environment, and missing middle is just inherent. And so millennials are also a strong market segment, but it's like the single women households have really shown up. Boomers have shown up, and millennials, to be honest, is like my kids too, is they don't necessarily want to live in a single family house, even if they could afford it, right? They don't want to. They want to live in a place where the action is. Sometimes that means giving up some square footage. It means living in stacked units or attached units. And so there's really a strong demand and need across market segments, which is great.
I think the other piece that will be interesting, and you mentioned the boomers, and I know not all of the missing middle products are rental, but I've also been curious as to how many of our boomers are still paying mortgages. So they choose to just take that and shift it to a rental product that meets more of their stage of life because they're still under a mortgage.
What our clients like on the rental projects is that they're a pretty stable resident. Like they're not likely going to move and they can pay their rent, right? So our clients really like them as a renter just because they're super stable and the turnover is a lot less. So it's interesting in that way as well.
Yeah, I was surprised in talking with Jerry how many of his renters are actually former homeowners who've made that choice to just wanting that lifestyle. After designing several of the missing middle developments and seeing those implemented, what are some of the lessons that you've learned? Or are there any things that you're kind of doing differently now from your first design?
It's a really good question. To be honest, we haven't really changed our master planning approach or our missing middle housing type design that much. I think what we've found is that we can actually be as aggressive as we'd like to be, and the market will respond. And one project I haven't mentioned yet, which can also tie into the parking conversation, is cul-de-sac Tempe, which will be the largest car-free community in the country when it's completed in a few years. And it's now deep into construction. They leased the first round of apartments in a little over an hour, and there's like 11,000 interested residents on a list. And so our designs adapt and are adjusted based on the region we're in, the climate we're in, what sort of particular aspects of the market, rent price points or sales price points that our clients needing to hit. But I think just really smart, creative master planning and type design is, I think we're really now able to really push the envelope, because enough of our projects now have proven to be hugely successful for our developer clients. And now we're having cities beg developers to do a good missing middle project. I just want to shout out to Mayor Black and Papillion. Very early on became a champion of the project and really helped ease and shorten the entitlement process, right? Because it kind of broke a lot of the rules, whether it be zoning. We had to rewrite the zoning. We had to rethink some engineering standards, how garbage was accessed. And that's pretty common in all of our projects. And so that local champion is really important. So I think that, identifying that champion within the city pretty early on is something that we've been really focusing on with a lot of our clients. So yeah, so it's exciting to be able to kind of take it to the next level in terms of implementation and in development now, really in any market that we're working in across the country.
So I'm a geek who always loves good case studies. So one of the things at the end of the book, I always wonder was there a case study that you felt like got left on the cutting room floor, or that you're really excited about now that's come around since the completion of the book?
Absolutely. I mean, number one is just being the zoning geek that I am, I actually did much more of a zoning deep dive, and it ended up getting cut out because the book was too long. So I've got a bunch of content. Maybe that's maybe there's like a zoning for missing middle book. But, my team has been doing really amazing missing middle work for the public sector over the last 3 years that didn't get into the book, partly because it was in progress. Some of them started after, but I compiled these case studies for my North Carolina APA keynote last week for the very first time. And it actually kind of like blew me away at the extent of the great work my team's doing. And the one thing that we've done is we've standardized a set of services for the public sector. And a big part of that is what we call a missing middle scan. And the second part of that is a missing middle deep dive. And because we were getting a lot of inquiries, but cities weren't quite sure what to ask for because, right, the conventional services they knew it wasn't going to quite deliver what they needed. And so in these missing middle scans and deep dives that we've now done for places as diverse as Greensboro, North Carolina to Idaho Falls, that identifies where missing middle should be prioritized and where there's policy, zoning, and barriers or gaps in their area planning to deliver that. And then it does a deep dive into zoning recommendations and policy recommendations to deliver that. And then that sort of has evolved into citywide feasibility analysis for missing middle application. And we recently completed that with various economic consultants for San Jose, California, and we're right in the middle of it for Sacramento, California. And that includes a really neat displacement analysis component that we're partnering with a group called Cascadia on. The great thing is like we've sort of been doing some really targeted sort of the missing middle scan and deep dive, but also sort of are looking at how do we maximize our impact by doing this at a regional scale and enabling this at a regional scale. And that we're super excited about the impact that we can have in these regions and being able to deliver these planning and zoning tools to enable that to happen.
the regional approach is really exciting because you think about even here I'm in the Omaha metro area, and Omaha may choose to do a policy or an approach, but if that's kind of not mirrored sometimes by our surrounding communities, I describe it as we live in a metro environment, and what one community chooses to do can really impact the direction growth goes or how that starts to look. So those regional approaches are exciting.
Yeah, and what we find is there's no reason for every one of those jurisdictions to have a different tool, right?
Yeah.
Why rethink the wheel every time? And often the staff sort of jumps around the different jurisdictions. And if they know the system, right, in a new job, that's great. And, a really important piece of that toolkit process, and it's really inherent in all of that missing middle work, is the analysis of the place, both at the macro scale, like sort of that the neighborhood patterns, as well as that what we call the micro scale, which is that block, lot, and building type scale. And all of those systems are based on that thorough analysis where we define a range of types of places that exist. And based on like the type of place your community is, like you pick a different set of the pieces out of that toolbox. So it's a subtractive approach so that most of what a city or a county is going to need is there. And they grab what they need, as opposed to a zoning template where you have to sort of add on to it, which is a little bit too cumbersome in a lot of instances.
And they're not being dictated to what they have to do. They can pick what's appropriate for their community.
Well, this has been a really interesting and fun conversation today. I've been kind of listening and thinking about ways that this can apply to Lincoln. We just finished our comprehensive plan earlier this year, and one of the goals in it is to look at and address the missing middle housing and the lack of it in our development areas. So this will be good to kind of share for our team that gets going on that, hopefully in the next year or so. But to wrap up this conversation, are there any major takeaways or themes that you think that listeners of this episode or readers of your book should take away?
There was one question that we didn't get a chance to jump into, but I think it's actually really critical to the sort of conversation about missing middle, which is about neighborhood services and retail. And I've always been a big fan and proponent of the neighborhood Main Street. Even in the Jocelyn Castle neighborhood that I lived in, it had the Radial Cafe and just a couple of little businesses, right, that were an important part of the social and economic fabric of the neighborhood. And a big part of Prairie Queen was us convincing Jerry that we needed those flex spaces to incubate small local businesses that could be apartments in the short term and evolve into businesses. And we were super pleasantly surprised that the pizza shop showed up pretty much immediately, that there was a fitness and yoga studio. And right, the pizza shop's now looking for a bigger space. And so across the street, it's likely that there'll be kind of bigger spaces. So I think that what we're seeing across the country is that the impact of COVID is that more people are working from home. And so there are people all day in their neighborhood to support those services in a way that prior to COVID, it was more and more challenging for those businesses to survive. But just as an example, in my neighborhood, there's a beer garden that's just a vacant lot that has a food truck with taps and some casual food and a bunch of picnic tables. And it's now open all day, every day. It used to be sort of evenings and weekends, but now there's enough people around during the week that it's now become this really social hub of the community, and it's made that business viable. So I think that component of neighborhood serving retail is critical to the idea of the walkable neighborhood and missing middle. In terms of a few sort of closing comments or sort of big takeaways, number one, we talked a little bit about this, but every city, every county, regardless of size, needs to be talking about this, framing this message with their constituents, the community members, decision makers, and really, diving deep into the policy and the zoning to enable this. It's not as simple as changing your zoning to multifamily, right? There's the impact of parking that needs to be discussed as an important and key part of that conversation. I think there's just great resources out there now. Obviously my book, but missingmiddlehousing.com is still there's a ton of traffic that goes through that website. It's just free online resource. There's a lot of ARP resources, that downloadable videos that they've recorded with us. The other thing is, don't be afraid to start by just taking pictures of local examples and making that the first point of communication with community members. And I'm just always shocked at like how reluctant the city planning staff is to just make the effort to do that, because I think it's invaluable. And the missingmiddlehousing.com, most people are just there looking at the pictures. I mean, there's a ton of really technical content, but most people are there like, hey, what is a cottage core? What does it look like, feel like? What is a townhouse? What is a fourplex? And don't be afraid to start really simple, because it's important to communicate at that level to non-planners, non-architects, non-developers at that level. So Chris Nelson wrote a chapter in my book about demand for missing middle housing and sort of who the demand, like what's the demographic. And he found in that specific research he did for that chapter was that 60% of all housing between now and 2040 would need to be missing middle housing in order to meet the demand. And so if you as a city want to position yourself economically and from an economic development perspective to retain residents, to encourage businesses, to encourage people to move, like focusing on missing middle is a really great economic development strategy. I think that since there is such a broad need and a strong demand, right? There's people that don't need it, but that want it. It's always a call to action for me as, to planners, to architects, to realtors, to decision makers, to mayors, realtors. It's like we all really can play a role in the delivery of this much needed housing. And so it's just a call to action for everybody to step up, to engage in that conversation and sort of play their role in enabling more of it to get delivered, because I think it's going to take us all to effectively deliver the numbers of housing units in missing middle that is really needed in every corner of the country.
I think that's a really great way to end this conversation. And I have a bunch of links that we'll put in the show notes as well, all the great resources that you mentioned. But I want to thank you for coming on our show today and talking about the book Missing Middle Housing.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Thanks, Stephanie. It was a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm always happy to help spread the missing middle message.